The year is 722 AD. From the gilded towers of Damascus to the shores of the Atlantic, the Umayyad Caliphate is the undisputed master of the known world. You are General Al-Qama, a commander of this unstoppable empire. And in your hands, you hold a report that makes you laugh. It speaks of a pathetic group of starving rebels hiding in a wet, fog-choked cave in the darkest corner of northern Spain. Your scouts report that these men are eating honey scraped from limestone rocks just to survive. You do not see an army. You see a nuisance. You grab your quill and write the phrase that will become your epitaph. You call them 30 wild donkeys. You turn to your officers with a sneer and ask, what damage can 30 donkeys do to us?
We strike at dawn,
that question is your death warrant. You are not marching towards a victory lap. You are marching the greatest war machine of the age into a geological guillotine. Those donkeys are not hiding. They are baiting you. In the next few hours, your laughter will be silenced by the sound of crushing stone and flowing blood. You are walking blindly into the Battle of Covadonga, the slaughterhouse where the conquest of Europe will finally bleed out. This is not just a battle. It is the moment history held its breath and the impossible became reality. To understand why a few hundred men in a damp cave mattered, you first have to understand the monster they were fighting. History books often describe the Islamic conquest of Spain as a war, but that is a polite understatement. It was not a war, it was a tsunami. In the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate was not just a powerful nation, it was the ultimate predator of the medieval world. Their armies had already swallowed the Persian Empire whole, shattered the Byzantines, and swept across North Africa like a desert wind. By 711 AD, they stood at the edge of the Atlantic, looking across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar at the trembling kingdom of the Visigoths. What happened next is one of the most terrifying examples of military efficiency in human history. It was a blitzkrieg, 1,200 years before the Germans invented the word. On April 30th, 711, the Berber commander, Tariq ibn Ziyad, landed on the rock that still bears his name, Gibel Tariq, or Gibraltar. He burned his ships, telling his men, behind you is the sea, before you is the enemy. There was no retreat. There was only conquest or death. And they chose conquest. The collision happened at the Battle of Guadalete in July 711. This should have been a titanic struggle. The Visigoths were the successors of Rome, a warrior culture bred in the cold forests of Germany. They had heavy cavalry, iron armor, and centuries of tradition. But within a single afternoon, their entire civilization was decapitated. King Roderick, the ruler of Hispania, vanished in the chaos. His body was never found. Only his white horse and his golden boots stuck in the muddy riverbank. With the king dead and the royal guard slaughtered, the central nervous system of the Visigothic state simply ceased to exist. What followed was not a slow, grinding campaign. It was a collapse of physics-defying speed. The Muslim armies didn't just defeat the Spanish defenders, they evaporated them. They moved north with a velocity that seemed supernatural to the terrified locals. Major cities, Toledo, Seville, Cordoba, did not withstand months of siege. They fell like dominoes. Some opened their gates in terror. Others were betrayed from within. The psychological shock of this expansion cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a world where the established order, the religion, and the government that has stood for 300 years is wiped out in less than 3 years. For the average citizen, this wasn't just a political change. It felt like the end of times. The speed of the Umayyad advance convinced both the conquerors and the conquered of one undeniable fact. God was on the side of the invaders. By 714 AD, the green tide had reached the foothills of the Pyrenees. The commanders of the Caliphate looked at the map and saw a conquered continent. They controlled everything from the olive groves of the south to the rainy coasts of the north. Or so they thought. In their rush to swallow the peninsula, they made a critical strategic oversight. They looked at the rugged, miserable mountains of Asturias in the far north and decided they were not worth the effort. Why would they bother? Asturias was a wet, foggy pile of limestone rocks. It had no gold, no great cities, and no strategic value. It was inhabited by poor shepherds and the broken remnants of the Visigothic nobility, who had fled there like rats escaping a sinking ship. The Umayyad generals, drunk on their own unprecedented success, made a calculation that would haunt them for 7 centuries. They assumed that nature would finish what their swords had started. They believed that the cold winters and starvation would kill off the refugees. This arrogance was the byproduct of their speed. When you conquer a country in 3 years, you stop respecting your enemy. You stop looking for threats in the shadows. The Umayyad war machine was designed for the open plains and the deserts, where their light cavalry could maneuver and flank. They had no interest in dismounting to fight in the mud and the mist. So, they turned their backs on the mountains. They established their glittering capital in Cordoba, built mosques on top of cathedrals, and began to tax the population. They thought the war was over. They thought the history of Christian Spain had ended at the Battle of Guadalete. But they were wrong. While the Caliphate was busy counting its gold and planning the invasion of France, something was stirring in the mist. The survivors in the north were not dying. They were hardening. The Blitzkrieg had destroyed the Visigothic kingdom, yes, but it had also distilled the resistance down to its purest, most desperate form. The weak had died or surrendered. Only the wolves were left, and they were waiting for a leader. To fully appreciate the miracle of the resistance later, we must first dissect the corpse of the kingdom that died. History often paints the fall of Hispania as a simple case of a stronger army beating a weaker one. But that is a half-truth. The Visigothic kingdom, which had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for 3 centuries since the fall of Rome, was not destroyed from the outside. It rotted from the inside out. By the year 710 AD, the kingdom was a political shark tank, a realm defined by assassination, civil war, and brutal power struggles. The fatal flaw of the Visigothic state was its succession crisis. Unlike most medieval kingdoms, where the crown passed from father to son, the Visigothic monarchy was elective. Every time a king died, the nobles fought a bloody battle royale to see who would wear the crown next. It was a system designed for chaos. And in 710, that chaos produced a king named Roderick. Roderick had seized the throne by force, blinding and imprisoning his rivals. He was a warrior, yes, but he was a usurper. Half the country hated him, and in the shadows, his enemies were willing to burn the kingdom down just to see him fall. This internal hatred created the perfect environment for the ultimate villain of this story, Count Julian. Julian was the governor of Ceuta, a fortress city on the North African coast. He was the gatekeeper of Europe. His one job was to stop any invasion from Africa. But Julian had a grudge that would change the map of the world. According to the most enduring historical accounts, Julian had sent his beautiful daughter to the royal court in Toledo for her education. There, King Roderick saw her, took what he wanted, and dishonored her. When Julian found out, he didn't demand an apology. He didn't declare a hopeless war. He quietly made a deal with the devil. Julian approached the rising Muslim commanders in North Africa and told them, "I will not only let you pass, I will give you the ships." It is one of history's coldest betrayals. The man paid to lock the door handed the keys to the burglar. When Tariq ibn Ziyad landed at Gibraltar, his troops were ferried across on Julian's own merchant vessels, disguised to look like a trade convoy. The radar was off because the security guard was the pilot. When the two armies finally met at the Battle of Guadalete, King Roderick should have won. He had the numbers. Nearly 30,000 men against 7,000 invaders. He had the heavy cavalry, but he didn't have loyalty. As the battle raged, the wings of Roderick's army, commanded by the relatives of the previous king he had usurped, simply stopped fighting. Some sources say they turned and attacked Roderick. Others say they just stood there, arms folded, watching him die. They had made a calculation. They thought the Muslims were just mercenaries hired to remove Roderick, and that once the job was done, the invaders would take their gold and go home, leaving the throne to them. They were wrong, dead wrong. They had invited a tiger into their house to catch a mouse, and they were surprised when the tiger decided to stay and eat them too. The rot went even deeper than the billet. The common people of Spain were tired. They were exhausted by high taxes, corruption, and famine. Even worse was the treatment of the Jewish population. The Christian Visigoths had enacted brutal laws against the Jews, forcing conversions, seizing property, and enslaving families. So, when the Muslim armies arrived, the Jews of Spain didn't see them as conquerors. They saw them as liberators.
May it be so.
In city after city, while the Visigothic nobles fled, the Jewish communities opened the gates and welcomed the new rulers who promised them religious tolerance. With the king dead, the army betrayed by its own generals, and the population indifferent or even hostile to their old masters, the Visigothic state collapsed instantly. There was no plan B. There was no heir. The mercenaries didn't go home. They realized the door was wide open, the house was empty, and the dinner was still warm on the table. They walked right through. This is the broken, treacherous world that our protagonist, Pelayo, was living in. He was a high-ranking nobleman, a member of the royal bodyguard at the Battle of Guadalete. He watched his king vanish, his friends get slaughtered, and his country dissolve into anarchy. He saw the betrayal with his own eyes, and as the green tide swallowed everything he knew, he realized that the old Spain was dead. If there was going to be a future, it wouldn't come from the palaces of Toledo. It would have to be built from scratch, in the mud and the blood of the wilderness. To understand the fury that would eventually erupt in the mountains, we have to look at where Pelayo was during the years of silence. He wasn't hiding in a cave immediately after the kingdom fell. He was in the belly of the beast. By 718 AD, Pelayo was not a free man. He was a hostage in Cordoba, the new glittering capital of al-Andalus. The Umayyad conquerors were smart. They didn't just slaughter every nobleman they found. That would incite rebellion. Instead, they took hostages. They took the sons and influential figures of the old regime and brought them south to domesticate them. They kept them in gilded cages, surrounding them with the luxury, science, and art of the Islamic Golden Age, hoping to turn them into compliant puppets. Pelayo was likely serving in the royal guard or some administrative role, watched closely by the emir. He was a prisoner in a paradise, forced to watch his conquerors build a new world on the ashes of his ancestors. But while Pelayo was trapped in the south, a different kind of conquest was happening in his homeland of Asturias. The Muslim governor of this northern province was a man named Munuza. Munuza was not a warrior like the generals who swept through in 711. He was a politician, a man who preferred diplomacy and strategic marriages over bloodshed. And Munuza had his eyes on a specific prize, Pelayo's sister. Historical accounts vary on the details. Some say her name was Adosinda, some say she was forced, others say it was a political arrangement. But the core conflict is undeniable. Munuza wanted to marry into the old royal bloodline to legitimize his rule over the Christians. To him, it was a smart political move. To Pelayo, news of this arrangement was not a marriage proposal. It was the final, unforgivable insult. It was the genetic erasure of his family. It was the conqueror
and then
taking
he fell
the
right
last
into the
thing
fountain.
the conquered had left. When the news reached
sure
Cordoba
you
that
tied up the
Munuza was
horses
moving
back
to
there?
claim his sister, something in Pelayo snapped. The passive hostage died, and the rebel was born. The civilized life in Cordoba suddenly felt like a chain around his neck. In 717 AD, he staged a daring escape. We don't have the Hollywood details of how he slipped past the guards, whether it was bribery, a disguise, or a midnight run across the rooftops.
Look at him.
But we know
Who is he?
covered nearly 500
don't like
miles
the
of
look of
hostile
this.
territory to get back to the north. He wasn't running to save his own skin. He was running to stop a wedding. He arrived in Asturias too late to stop Munuza's influence from taking root, but just in time to light a fire. Pelayo confronted the governor. This was a moment of incredible danger. He walked into the lion's den and openly defied the representative of the Caliphate. Munuza, likely surprised by the audacity of this fugitive, ordered his immediate arrest. This is where the legend of Pelayo truly begins. He didn't submit. He fought his way out. There is a famous account of Pelayo fleeing across the Pilona River. As Munuza's troops closed in, Pelayo didn't surrender. He plunged into the rushing waters, clinging to his horse while arrows splashed around him. He swam to the other side, shivering, exhausted, but free. That swim was his crossing the Rubicon. When he pulled himself onto the muddy bank on the other side, he was no longer a nobleman. He was an outlaw. He had officially declared war on the greatest empire on earth, with nothing but the sword at his hip and the wet clothes on his back. He didn't run to France to hide. He ran deeper into the wild. He headed for the Picos de Europa. To the Umayyad soldiers chasing him, he was just a loose end, a fugitive who would soon freeze to death. They didn't realize that by chasing him into the mountains, they were driving a spark into a powder keg. Pelayo was returning to the one place where the heavy cavalry of the south couldn't follow, the one place where the old Visigothic spirit was still alive. He was going home to build an army. If the south of Spain was a paradise of olive groves and golden cities, the north was a prison of stone. The Picos de Europa, or Peaks of Europe, are not merely mountains. They are a fortress built by tectonic plates. Rising abruptly from the sea, they form a jagged wall of limestone teeth that juts straight into the Atlantic clouds. This is a landscape defined by extreme verticality. Deep, sunless gorges, razor-sharp cliffs, and a labyrinth of caves carved by millions of years of water erosion. For the local Asturians, these peaks were a sanctuary. They knew every goat path, every hidden spring, and every sudden drop that could kill a man in armor. But for an Umayyad soldier raised in the deserts of Arabia or the warm, open plains of North Africa, marching into Asturias was like landing on a hostile planet. The weather here is its own weapon. The Atlantic winds slam into the limestone, creating a perpetual cycle of freezing rain, blinding fog, and sudden snowstorms. It is wet, cold, and utterly miserable for an army reliant on speed and cavalry. Pelayo did not flee into this wilderness alone. As he moved through the mist-shrouded valleys, a gravitational shift occurred. The wild donkeys, as they would soon be insulted, began to gather. They were a ragtag collection of broken men, Visigothic nobles who had lost their estates, peasants crushed by the new taxes, and young men who had grown up in the shadow of national shame. They saw in Pelayo the only thing that mattered in a world of surrender, a man who refused to kneel. By 718 AD, this band of refugees held a council in the shadow of the peaks. near the village of Cangas de Onís. This moment was the antithesis of the opulent ceremonies taking place in Cordoba. There were no silk robes, no incense, and no bishops chanting in Latin. It was a desperate meeting in the mud. But it was here that they resurrected the soul of their people. Reverting to the ancient pagan customs of their Germanic ancestors, the warriors did not place a crown on Pelayo's head. Instead, they took their leader and physically raised him up on a shield. They lifted him high above their heads, shouting his name, proclaiming him Princeps, Prince. It was a raw, primitive coronation. It symbolized that his power did not come from a throne, but from the men who held him up. This moment marked the birth of the Kingdom of Asturias, a kingdom that consisted of nothing but a few valleys and a lot of wet rocks, but a kingdom that was, for the first time in 7 years, free. Crucially, Governor Menuza made a fatal strategic error. He watched this gathering from afar and did nothing. He looked at the terrifying terrain, looked at the coming winter, and assumed that nature would do the work of the executioner. Why waste soldiers hunting rats in a maze? He believed the cold and starvation would kill them by spring. He was wrong. For 4 years, from 718 to 722, Pelayo didn't die. He prepared. He turned the geography into an ally. He scouted the narrow passes and found the cave of Covadonga, Cova Dominica, a natural indentation in a sheer cliff face hovering above a narrow valley where 2 rivers meet. He realized that this wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a choke point, a geological funnel where numbers didn't matter. Pelayo knew the Umayyads would eventually come to finish the job. He knew they couldn't ignore a rival king forever. And when they did come, he wouldn't meet them on the open field, where their heavy cavalry was invincible. He would invite them into his house, into the dark, narrow throat of the mountains, and he would slam the door shut. He spent those quiet years turning the valley into a kill box, sharpening the trap, and waiting for the enemy to be arrogant enough to step inside. The silence in the mountains broke in the spring of 722 AD. The order finally came from Cordoba to deal with the nuisance in the north. General Alcama, a seasoned commander who had likely fought across North Africa, marched his massive army into the throat of the Picos de Europa. Historical sources vary wildly on the numbers. Christian chronicles claim an impossible 187,000 men, while modern historians suggest a more realistic force of 10,000 to 20,000 effective combatants. But the specific number is irrelevant. Whether it was 10,000 or 10 million, the dynamic was the same. A leviathan was coming to crush a gnat. Alcama expected a police action. He expected to march in, accept a surrender, chop off a few heads to make a point, and be back in the warm south before the autumn rains. He didn't know he was walking into a geological trap. He didn't know that the wild donkeys had spent 4 years sharpening their hooves. And he certainly didn't know that he was marching his men into a grave dug by ghosts. As the Umayyad column wound its way through the narrow gorge leading to Covadonga, the walls of the canyon closed in. The massive numerical advantage of the Caliphate began to evaporate. In a valley that is only a few meters wide, an army is not a force, it is a traffic jam. But before the first arrow was loosed, General Alcama decided to play his political trump card. He did not send a warrior to the base of the cave. He sent a priest. Riding forward on a mule, dressed in the finery of his office, was Bishop Oppas. Oppas is one of the most fascinating and reviled figures in Spanish history. He was the son of a previous king, a man of high noble birth and a prince of the church. But to the starving men hiding in the cave, he was something else entirely. A collaborator. Oppas represented the faction of Visigoths, who had decided that it was better to be a live servant than a dead king. He had kept his wealth, his position, and his head, by bowing to the new masters in Cordoba. He rode up to the mouth of the gorge, within shouting distance of Pelayo, who stood on the lip of the cave. The historical chronicles, specifically the Chronicle of Alfonso III, record the conversation that followed. While we must always be skeptical of speeches recorded years later, the essence of this dialogue captures the soul of the conflict perfectly. Opus didn't threaten Pelayo. He tried to seduce him with logic. He shouted up to the cave, his voice echoing off the damp limestone walls. "Pelayo, my brother, you are a wise man. You know the reality of our situation. The entire army of the Goths, with all their chivalry and strength, could not stand against the Ishmaelites. Every great city in Spain has fallen. Toledo is gone. Zaragoza is gone.
Do not
How can
be
you,
afraid.
on this little mountain,
We offer only
hope to
solace
succeed
and
where an
understanding
entire
here.
kingdom failed?" It was a seductive argument. It was the voice of reason. Opus offered him a deal. "Come down, pledge loyalty to the Caliphate, and you will be allowed to govern this region as a friend of Cordoba. You will be rich. You will be safe. You will have a future for the men shivering in the dark behind you. Why die for a kingdom that no longer exists? Why not take the deal?" But Pelayo's response changed the course of European history. He didn't answer with military statistics or requests for reinforcements. He answered with theology and defiance. Standing at the mouth of the cave, looking down at the bishop who had sold his soul for comfort, Pelayo shouted back, "Have you not read in the Holy Scriptures that the church of the Lord is like a mustard seed?
Without the Lord's grace
Being the smallest of all, it grows to be greater than all." He took a breath and delivered the line that would become the motto of the Reconquista. "I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their rule, for we rely on the mercy of God, that from this little mountain, the salvation of Spain will arise." From this little mountain.
them back to the sea.
With those words, Pelayo drew a line in the rock. He rejected the new normal. He declared that the conquest was not a permanent reality, but a temporary tribulation. He was betting everything, his life, his men, his family, on the idea that a single spark could survive a hurricane. Opus realized that words had failed. He saw the fire in Pelayo's eyes and knew there was no negotiation. He turned his mule around and rode back to General Alcama. The bishop's report was brief and chilling. "He will not surrender. He must fight. But be careful, General, for only God knows what the outcome will be." Alcama likely sneered at the warning. He was a man of the sword, not a man of metaphors. He looked up at the cave, at the sheer cliffs, and at the ragtag group of rebels. He didn't see a mustard seed of resistance. He saw target practice. He raised his hand. The drums of war began to beat, echoing thunderously in the confined valley. He gave the order that would doom his army.
Betrayed.
Advance.
The Emperor's Guard are
The Battle of
compromised. They know our
Covadonga
position.
did not begin with a charge.
People are
It
starving,
began with a
General.
physics lesson.
For the sake of
General
God, I beg
Alcama,
you, lift the
confident in
siege
his
before more
overwhelming
lives are
superiority,
lost.
ordered his vanguard to soften up the target. The Umayyad archers and slingers moved into position at the base of the cliff. Their orders were simple: rain death into the cave mouth until the rebels were too broken to fight. Then send in the infantry to mop up the blood. It was a standard siege tactic. It worked in 100 battles from Damascus to Toledo. But the Picos de Europa do not obey the rules of standard warfare. As the first volley of arrows blackened the sky, the men in the valley were about to learn a brutal truth about geometry. The cave of Covadonga is not a deep, flat tunnel. It is a shallow, stony overhang, protecting a deep recess. When you shoot an arrow from below, at a steep, acute angle, if you miss the fleshy target by even an inch, the projectile hits the hard limestone ceiling. And what happens when a high-velocity arrow hits stone at an angle? It doesn't stick. It ricochets. The Christian chronicles, written with the ink of religious fervor, say that the arrows returned against those who shot them by the hand of God. While the medieval mind saw a miracle, modern ballistics sees a vector equation. The Umayyad archers were firing into a stone bowl. The arrows shattered, bounced, and rained back down onto the tightly packed ranks of their own soldiers. Panic rippled through the front lines. Men were being struck by their own friendly fire. They looked up, confused, shielding their eyes not from enemy fire, but from the rebounding hail of their own aggression. The barrage stopped. The archers hesitated, and in that split second of confusion, while the monster was blinking, Pelayo gave the signal. From the mouth of the cave, the 30 wild donkeys didn't hide. They charged. They poured out of the sanctuary like a landslide. The psychological shock to the Umayyad vanguard was total. One moment they were dodging their own arrows. The next, men with rusty swords, axes, and desperation in their eyes were on top of them. But the 300 men in the cave were just the bait. The real teeth of the trap were hidden higher up. Pelayo knew he couldn't beat the Umayyad heavy infantry man-to-man on flat ground. So, he had turned the landscape itself into ammunition. Along the high ridges of the gorge, hidden in the thick morning mist and the dense forests, were the rest of his forces. These weren't soldiers. They were the villagers, the farmers, the women, and the old men who had fled into the mountains. They had spent days loosening massive limestone boulders and piling up heavy tree trunks on the precipice. As soon as the chaos erupted at the cave mouth, the second signal was given. The ridges exploded. Tons of rock and timber came crashing down into the narrow valley floor. Imagine the scene inside that gorge. The Umayyad army was packed shoulder to shoulder, a river of steel and flesh confined by vertical stone walls. When the rocks fell, there was nowhere to dodge. There was no formation to hold. The rear guard was still pushing forward, unaware of the disaster at the front, while the vanguard was trying to push back to escape the slaughter. The result was a crush. Men were trampled by their own horses. The famed discipline of the Caliphate's army evaporated in seconds. This is the brutal mathematics of the kill box. In a space 10 meters wide, having 10,000 soldiers is not an advantage. It is a liability. Only the first row can fight. The rest are just waiting to die. The numerical superiority of the Umayyads became their coffin. The Asturians, light on their feet, unarmored, and knowing every foothold of the terrain, moved through the chaos like wolves in a sheep pen. They struck from above, from the sides, and from the front. They didn't target the common soldiers. They targeted the officers, the banners, and the horses. They turned the gorge into a meat grinder. In the center of this maelstrom was General Alcama. To his credit, he didn't run. He tried to rally his men, shouting orders over the din of crashing rocks and screaming horses, trying to create space for a counterattack. But a general in a gorge is just another man on a frightened horse. The chronicles state that Alcama fell in the thick of the fighting, cut down by the very donkeys he had mocked only hours before. The death of Alcama was the final nail. In ancient and medieval warfare, the army is the general. When the head is cut off, the body dies. Word of his death rippled through the panic-stricken ranks like an electric shock. Alcama is dead. The general has fallen. The will to fight vanished instantly. The Umayyad soldiers, the conquerors of the world, dropped their shields and turned to run. But running was just as dangerous as fighting. The path back was blocked by their own reinforcements and the piles of debris raining down from the cliffs. The retreat turned into a rout. It is important to emphasize that this wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was an extermination. The Asturians were venting years of humiliation, grief, and loss. They fought with the ferocity of men defending their last inch of earth. The river Deva, which runs through the valley, was said to have run red for days. By the time the sun hit the bottom of the gorge, the invincible army was shattered. The survivors, those lucky enough to escape the killing box, fled east, desperate to get out of the mountains. They thought they had escaped hell. They were wrong. They were just moving to the second circle of it. The trap at Covadonga was only the beginning. The mountains were not done with them yet. For Pelayo, standing amidst the wreckage of the greatest army of his age, looking at the bodies of the men who had mocked him, this was vindication. The wild donkeys had kicked back, but he knew the job wasn't done. You don't just wound a beast like the Umayyad Caliphate. You have to make sure it doesn't come back. The chase was on. The survivors of the slaughter at Covadonga didn't regroup. They ran. The remnants of the Umayyad force, leaderless, terrified, and bleeding, fled east through the high passes of the Picos de Europa. They were trying to reach the Liébana Valley, a flatter region where their horses might stand a chance, or at least where they could find a road back to the safety of the south.
Echo Company,
but they were lost in a labyrinth of fog and stone. The retreat took them through a place called Koskea. Even today, this is a treacherous landscape of unstable slopes and river gorges. In the year 722, it was a death trap waiting to spring. Historical chronicles describe a scene of biblical destruction. As the retreating column marched along a narrow track next to the river Diva, the earth beneath them began to groan. Whether it was caused by the heavy spring rains that often plague this region, or the sheer vibration of thousands of panicked men and horses stomping on loose limestone, the result was catastrophic. The side of the mountain didn't just slide, it sheared off. A massive landslide roared down the slopes. It wasn't just rocks, it was the mountain itself collapsing. The Chronicle of Alfonso III, written nearly 2 centuries later, describes it with religious awe. The mountain came down upon them and crushed them, and they were buried there. It goes on to say that 63,000 men were killed, a number that is almost certainly an exaggeration typical of medieval writers. But the core truth remains: the army was erased. For the Christian chroniclers, this was the hand of God. Just as the Red Sea closed over Pharaoh's army, the Picos de Europa closed over the Umayyads. It validated their cause. It proved that the land itself was rejecting the invader. From a modern historical perspective, we see a brutal collision of geology and warfare. A routed army, unfamiliar with the terrain, forced onto unstable ground during the wet season,
as the tectonic forces
is a recipe
build,
for a
the
landslide.
unstable strata begin to
The
slip
devastation
along the
was
fault line,
total.
resulting in
The
a
River
sudden,
Deva was
dramatic
reportedly
displacement.
dammed by the debris in the bodies,
We cannot stop
creating
it.
a gruesome blockage that took days to clear. This event at Kosgaya is crucial because it turned a defeat into an annihilation. If these thousands of soldiers had escaped, they could have regrouped. They could have returned to Cordoba, gathered reinforcements, and marched back the next summer with a map and a better plan. But they didn't return. The entire expeditionary force of General Alcama vanished. For the Umayyad governors in the south, the silence from the north must have been deafening. An army marched out and simply ceased to exist. No messengers returned. No survivors came limping back to tell the tale. The wild donkeys hadn't just bitten, they had devoured the lion whole. This total destruction created a psychological barrier. The mountains of Asturias were no longer just insignificant. They were cursed. They were a graveyard. While the landslides were burying the army of the Caliphate in the mountains, Governor Munuza, the man who started this all by kidnapping Pelayo's sister, was sitting in his palace in the coastal city of Gijón. He was waiting for good news. He expected a messenger to arrive with Pelayo's head in a bag. Instead, he got silence. And then he got rumors. Terrified survivors from the periphery of the battle began to trickle into the city, whispering about a massacre, about mountains falling from the sky, and about a ghost army that couldn't be killed.
Warn the king.
Munuza realized instantly that the game was up. He was a politician, and he knew how to read the wind. The countryside, which had been passive under his rule, was suddenly hostile. The locals were looking at him differently. The fear was gone from their eyes, replaced by something far more dangerous. Hope. He knew that Gion, a port city, was indefensible against a guerrilla force that owned the surrounding highlands. If he stayed, he would be besieged and slaughtered. So, Munuza did what Al-Qama's army had tried to do. He ran. He gathered his treasury, his personal guard, and likely Pelayo's sister, if she was indeed still his captive, and fled south. His plan was to reach the safety of the Meseta, the central plateau, where the cavalry of the Emirates still ruled supreme.
We must leave now.
But Pelayo was not just a warrior, he was now a hunter. He had anticipated Munuza's move. The Asturians came down from the peaks, moving faster through the familiar valleys than Munuza could move along the Roman roads. The interception took place at a valley called Umayyads. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Munuza, the man who had tried to erase Pelayo's lineage, the man who represented the humiliation of the Visigothic nobility, found himself cornered. History is vague on the exact details of his death. Some say he was killed in the skirmish, others say he was captured and executed. But the outcome was final. Munuza died on the road, fleeing the kingdom he thought he owned. With Munuza dead and Al-Qama buried under the rocks of Kosgaya, the slate was wiped clean. There was not a single active Umayyad combat unit left in Asturias. The impossible had happened. In a few weeks, a group of refugees had decapitated the provincial government and annihilated the expeditionary army. Now, the silence in the mountains wasn't one of fear. It was one of victory. The rebels gathered again, perhaps in the same field near Cangas de Onis, where they had first conspired. But this time, the mood was different. They weren't fugitives anymore. They were conquerors. Pelayo, the man who had been a hostage in Cordoba, was now the undisputed king of Asturias. He established his capital at Cangas de Onis. It was a humble village compared to the marble splendor of Damascus or Cordoba, but it had one distinct advantage. It was his. However, Pelayo was a pragmatist. He knew that winning one battle does not win a war. He knew that the Umayyad Caliphate was a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more would grow. History is littered with charismatic rebel leaders who win a few battles, but whose movements disintegrate the moment they die. The Kingdom of Asturias was still just a fragile embryo. It was poor, underpopulated, and completely surrounded by the most advanced superpower on Earth. So, why didn't the Umayyads return with a larger army the next year? Why didn't they crush this tiny kingdom? The answer lies in a strategy that was as brutal as it was brilliant. It wasn't about holding territory. It was about weaponizing emptiness. Pelayo and his immediate successors, particularly his son-in-law, Alfonso I, realized they could not defend the open plains south of the mountains.
Look at those
if the
endless
Umayyad
plains,
heavy cavalry
Alfonso.
marched
How can we
north on
possibly
flat
defend
ground,
such open land?
the
We
Asturians
can't, my
would
liege.
lose every
It is a
time.
strategic nightmare.
So, they created a shield of nothingness. Historians call it the Desert of the Duero. The Asturian kings launched raids south into the Duero River basin. But they didn't conquer the towns to rule them. They conquered them to empty them. They killed the local Muslim garrisons, burned the crops, destroyed the bridges, and forcibly migrated the Christian population back north into the safety of the mountains. They turned a massive strip of land, hundreds of miles wide, between the Kingdom of Asturias and the Caliphate, into a no-man's land. It was a scorched earth policy on a continental scale. For nearly a century, this buffer zone remained depopulated. It was a wasteland. Any Umayyad army trying to march north to crush Asturias would have to cross this desolate void. They would find no food to forage, no water to drink, no villages to loot, and no shelter from the sun. By the time they reached the foothills of the mountains, they would be starving, exhausted and demoralized. Perfect targets for an ambush. This strategic buffer changed the calculus of the war. The Umayyad military, pragmatic to the core, looked at the cost-benefit analysis. To conquer Asturias meant marching through a desert to fight insane guerrillas in a pile of wet rocks. And the prize? There was no gold, no silk, no spice, just poverty and death. So, they categorized Asturias as Dar al-Harb, the House of War, a hostile territory not worth the blood it cost to take. They turned their attention to easier, richer targets in France, a decision that would eventually lead them to another defeat at the Battle of Tours 10 years later. But for Asturias, this neglect was a gift. The strategy of emptiness allowed the kingdom to incubate. Behind the safety of the mountains and the desert, a new society began to form. It was a fusion of Visigothic nobility and local mountaineer toughness. They built churches that looked like fortresses. They wrote laws. They began to see themselves not just as rebels, but as the legitimate heirs to the Roman and Visigothic tradition. While the rest of Europe was sinking into the Dark Ages, this tiny pocket of resistance became an ark. It preserved the culture, the religion, and the identity of a lost Spain. It became a beacon. Christians from the south, tired of living as second-class citizens under Islamic rule, migrated north. They crossed the dangerous desert of the Duero to reach the free lands. They brought with them skills, art, and a burning desire for reclamation. The Umayyad Caliphate, meanwhile, was distracted by its own internal problems. Civil wars, Berber revolts, and the logistical nightmare of running an empire that spanned 3 continents. They didn't see the cancer growing on their flank. They didn't realize that the wild donkeys were evolving into wolves. By the 9th century, the Kingdom of Asturias was no longer hiding. It was pushing back. It moved its capital from the caves of Cangas to the city of Oviedo. It began to recolonize the lands it had once emptied. The Reconquista had shifted from a desperate defense into a slow, grinding offense. This was the true genius of Pelayo's legacy. He didn't just win a battle, he bought enough time for a nation to be born. To truly understand the scale of what happened in that damp cave, we have to zoom out. We have to look at the long, bloody road that stretches from the Battle of Covadonga in 722 AD to the gates of Granada in 1492 AD. It is terrifying to think how thin the thread of history actually is. Historians often play the what-if game, and Covadonga is one of the biggest what-ifs of all time. If General Alcama had been a little more patient, if a stray arrow had struck Pelayo in the throat, or if the rocks at Cosgaya had held firm just a few seconds longer, the world we live in today would not exist. Without this victory, Islamic rule over the Iberian Peninsula would likely have become absolute. There would have been no Kingdom of Asturias to push south. Without Asturias, there would be no Kingdom of Leon, no Castile, no Portugal, and no Spain. And without Spain, there would have been no Queen Isabella in 1492 to finance a crazy Genovese sailor named Christopher Columbus. The languages, religions, and cultures of the entire Americas, from Mexico to Argentina, would be unrecognizable. The geopolitical map of the modern world was drawn in that cave. But Pelayo didn't know any of that. He wasn't fighting for the discovery of the new world. He wasn't fighting for the glory of an empire that wouldn't exist for another 800 years. He was fighting for something much simpler and much more profound. He was fighting for his home. The war he started, the Reconquista, would last for 770 years. It is the longest war in human history. It was a grind of centuries, fought by generations of kings and queens, who all looked back at that cave as their spiritual origin. When the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella finally conquered Granada and ended Islamic rule in Spain, they didn't see it as a new conquest. They saw it as the completion of the mission Pelayo started. Today, if you travel to the Picos de Europa, you can still visit the Holy Cave. It is a place of profound silence, broken only by the sound of the waterfall crashing into the pool below. It has become a sanctuary, a cathedral of nature. Inside, carved into the rock wall, is a simple tomb. The inscription on the tomb of King Pelayo reads, "Here lies King Pelayo of Oviedo." It was he who, in this marvelous place, began a new reign that arose from the ashes. It is a humble resting place for a man who saved a civilization. But perhaps that is fitting. Pelayo was not a man of palaces. He was a man of the mountains. He reminds us that history is not always made by the massive empires or the invincible armies. Sometimes it is made by a handful of people backed into a corner who look at the impossible odds stacked against them and simply say, no. The Battle of Covadonga teaches us that even when the map is painted in the colors of the enemy, and even when the experts say that all hope is lost, as long as there is one mustard seed of resistance left, the story isn't over. A single spark, protected in a dark cave, can eventually burn down a forest. If this story proves anything, it is that history is not written in stone. It is written in will. The survival of an entire civilization hung by a thread in that damp cave, reminding us that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can echo for eternity. It forces us to ask, how many other Covadongas have been lost to time because the rebels didn't survive to tell the tale? Now, I want to turn this over to you. Do you believe the Reconquista was an inevitable geopolitical shift? Or was Pelayo's survival truly a divine miracle, as the medieval chroniclers claimed? And are there other last stand stories from your own country's history that the world needs to hear? Let's discuss in the comments below.
Patience is the key to...
I find the most incredible insights often come from this community. If you value these deep, unvarnished dives into the turning points of our past, please consider hitting the like button. It is a small gesture that helps these stories survive in the algorithm. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten corners of time. Thank you for watching.